We humans are storytellers. And those stories are stories which are both true as well as stories we make up. And when we think about the stories we make up, they range from the ghost stories that children tell each other and sleepovers, through to fabrications and self-deceptions, through to the tales that our subconscious weaves for us at night in the form of dreams. And then there are novelists. Novelists invent enormous stories, hundreds of pages of stories, and for the life of those books, they try and persuade readers that their stories are true. But the thing is about those invented stories that they usually don't get plucked out of thin air. Usually, and this is certainly the case for me, they're formed from things that we see and hear, or more often from an experience that's so urgent that we have a need to share it. I want to talk about that process today. I want to talk about the process by which real-world sparks can lead to the creation of novels, and then the way those fictional stories in turn might shape the real world. The way that fiction might help shift perspectives and the role that it may play in social change. Some years ago, I heard a story about a veteran who'd returned from a war in the Middle East. He was a young man who'd returned home with what we now describe as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. After his military experience, his life had fragmented. He'd become, for the first time, someone who was quick to anger, someone who saw injustice all around him, and he took issue with the smallest of slights, including when he was in the traffic. And so one day, after an altercation of some sort or another with a fellow driver in the traffic, he chased that driver down the highway, overtook the driver, and forced the car off the road. The unsuspecting driver's car rolled and he was badly injured. It was a serious case of road rage. And so here we had a young soldier suffering from PTSD through no fault of his own, in circumstances where he wasn't the only person bearing the cost of his injury, but rather in direct and tangible ways, so were we as a community. And when we as a country sent that soldier off to fight a war for us in the Middle East, very few of us would have anticipated that the aftermath for him and for us would have looked like this. So that story got me thinking about another story, one closer to home and one personal. Back in 1915, my grandfather volunteered for a war, like many hundreds of thousands of other, mainly men, on the other side of the world. It was a war, as we know, which was dubbed the War to End Wars, though, as we also know, it wasn't and it didn't. My grandfather returned home, and when he returned home, he returned with memories, some of which he recorded. And I would like to read one of those memories of his for you today. This is what he wrote about his time on the Western Front. He wrote, "Near the end of the war, as we advanced through French territory, we were constantly in the midst of women, children, and crippled men. To see shells, German and ours, land in a crowd of these defenceless people and kill and maim them by the score was a sickening and unforgettable sight." Think about those two adjectives, unforgettable and sickening. In what ways might the experience of a young soldier be experiences that he or she, despite their best efforts, be unable to forget? In what ways might those experiences literally make them sick? My grandfather wasn't able to shake his experiences. his experiences became marked indelibly on his subconscious in the form of nightmares. Nightly reminders across his life of the battlefield carnage that he'd witnessed in a war 100 years ago. And so, here we are, again, 18 years into our longest war ever in Afghanistan. A war which has been played out beyond the field of vision of most of us, in a country very few of us have ever visited. It's a war where media access is limited, where we hear next to nothing about the impact of our involvement in that war on the local population, good or bad. It's a war where we hear intermittent stories about the Taliban launching attacks on civilian targets, or about veterans committing suicide on Anzac Day, or about how we're patiently waiting for a peace deal between the government that we helped install and the Taliban, who after 18 years are going nowhere. What does fiction have to say about things like this, about other important social issues? Think of a novel that you've read and that you've enjoyed. Chances are that novel will have introduced you to some very particular characters. Characters with particular physical features, facial features, sets of relationships, families, pasts, dreams and loves, strengths and frailties. And for the life of that novel, you follow the journey of those characters. And if the novel is successful, you come to care about what happens to those characters. What happens in their lives matters. And if a novel is successful, it provides an opportunity to walk through a doorway to an experience that's an experience we may not have had an opportunity to have in our own lives. Because fiction can change perspectives. Fiction can make connections. Fiction can give human scale to complex social issues. It can allow us to walk in the shoes of characters, to walk in the shoes of people that, if we approach a novel in an open-hearted way, may give us an opportunity to enhance our experience of empathy. Because fiction has a power that non-fiction often does not. And it's a seductive power. Because when we approach fiction, we usually approach fiction with our emotions, with our hearts. Whereas when we read non-fiction, we tend to read it critically with our minds. Back in my non-fiction life as a lawyer, I've had the opportunity over the years to act for many people who suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. Not just soldiers, but men and women who've worked in the emergency services, or people who've been involved in car accidents, or people who've suffered home invasions or have been the victims of domestic violence. When a lawyer acts for a client, often the lawyer has an opportunity to receive stories from multiple perspectives about that client. You sit down with your client, of course, and you listen to them. But often, you'll sit down with that person's friends and family, and you'll hear other stories about the way in which an injury like post-traumatic stress disorder has changed the personalities, sometimes in devastating ways, of their loved ones. You have the opportunity of reading experts from the medical field, psychiatrists and psychologists, who in their expert reports set out their diagnoses and their prognoses and their recommendations for therapeutic treatment. You also have the opportunity of reading GPs' clinical records, which in abbreviated form and sometimes in medical terminology that's difficult to decipher, but no less compelling or powerful because of that, you read the stories of their patients taking one step forward and sometimes 2 steps back on their journey of treatment. These stories are powerful stories to have shared with you. What can fiction do with stories of healing, suffering, and healing. Can I say something first about what fiction can't do? What novels can't do is they can't be representative. A novel can't speak on behalf of all people who've suffered from war trauma or domestic violence. In fact, a novel can't speak on behalf of anyone who has. A novel can't speak on behalf of my grandfather or my clients or any of us who've found ways of healing from experiences of trauma. Because every individual's own experience is uniquely their own. And the power of its story is filled with its own unique strength. But what novels can do is they can build bridges. A novel can say to a reader, let me tell you a story about this character, and this one, and this one. And if the novel is successful, you'll have an opportunity of walking in the shoes of that character. And if it's successful, at the end of the book, you may see the world a little differently. Fiction has told stories about the world around us since the beginning of storytelling. Think about Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's a little dated to our eyes and ears now, but when it was published, it was instrumental in illuminating for white audiences in the United States the injustices of slavery. Think of George Orwell's 1984. It's a book that has so deeply entered our collective consciousness that we use it now as a touchstone when we talk about the excesses of state control. We talk about the risks of Big Brother and about government doublespeak, and we talk about futures potentially being Orwellian. Fiction has also dealt with the cost of war. What is Homer's The Odyssey if it's not a story about the challenges of returning home from the battlefield? Sure, Odysseus may have spent 10 years on the plains of Troy fighting the Trojans, but it took him another 10 years to return home to his wife and his son. And even then, they didn't immediately recognise the man that he'd become. Think of more recent novels, Pat Barker's Regeneration trilogy, Joseph Heller's Catch-22, Richard Flanagan's Long Road to the Deep North. Books like these can provoke debate about whether or not the cost of war trauma is borne not just by the soldiers suffering from it, but by the community more generally. They can provoke debate about whether countries that send their soldiers to war do enough to ensure they don't return with psychological wounds. They can provoke debate about whether next time we get invited to join a war, the cost is worth it. Or they can ask questions about whether the experience of soldiers on the battlefield and the trauma suffered from that experience is similar to the trauma suffered from domestic violence. Not all novels will change the world, but novels can. Because all it takes is one novel to change one perspective. And then another, and then another, and then another after that. Because that's the way the world changes, one perspective at a time. Thank you.